Okay guys, good morning. How are you doing? You're good? Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock. Today I want to talk with you about two things, about mechanisms and about the micro and the macro links. So this is stuff that connects back to some of the things I already talked about before. You know, in the first lecture, it came up in the second lecture as well. Now we dwell a little more on this. Before then, on Thursday, we go into more substantive parts of this lecture. So, as I said, I want to talk about mechanisms and the macro link. Well, first of all, remember how people used to make explanations before, right? Or actually, some people still make it like that. You know, they kind of observe two different things at the same time. They connect the dots, and then they say, hey, we found an explanation. We know that the one is related to the other, and then they leave, and then they go, right? So that's sort of what is in the literature known as the covering law model or the deductive nomological model. You know, there is something on the one side, the explanans, there is fire, and it explains something else. That's sort of the explanandum, then there is fire. And that's fine, you know, that's sort of one thing that people did, but as you can already tell, you know, there's a whole lot of things happening in between, right? How do we get from the one to the other? And without being clear about how we get from our explanans to the explanandum, you know, there might be so many things why that is the case, right? There might be so many alternatives and different ways how something comes about, or we are completely wrong in our idea, in our assessment, how something that we observe is being produced. And there I have a little example for you. So let's see how this goes now. Yeah? So all the wisdom in the world, you know, lies with The Simpsons. That's one of my favorite shows. Not only because it's hilariously funny and it runs forever, but also because The Simpsons actually, if you look into it, they cover a lot of interesting stuff. Actually, the other day I came a book. It's called Homo Economics, not Homo Economicus, but Homo Economicus, which explains the principles of microeconomics using The Simpsons, right? And that's actually a very funny read. I can't wait. I ordered the book. I can't wait to have a closer look at it. However, The Simpsons also tell us something about how we make explanations, right? And how we sometimes make very wrong explanations, right? Okay, so I have this little thing here. Let's watch The Simpsons. It's Tuesday morning. What else are we going to do?
Our emerging concerns are low productivity and record high worker accident. Any suggestions? Round layoffs might wake up the idiots.
The caffeine in the water.
Well, those are my ideas. You people don't think, you regurgitate. That's why I promoted someone who's in touch with the workers. You.
I think you mean him, sir.
You then. How would you improve the worker situation?
Well, sir, for one thing, we had a problem every Tuesday when the cafeteria would serve fish.
Fish sticks? What in blazes are you talking about?
Well, sir, they cut the head off the fish and chop up the rest of the sticks and then put seasoned bread.
I know what fish sticks are. Get to the point.
Well, you only get this tiny little cup of tartar sauce to dip in them, and I always run out.
You stop wasting our time, Simpson. Shut up, Smithers. Can't you see what he's saying? A happy worker is a busy worker. 3 cents worth of tartar sauce could save us thousands of man-hours in labor. I like the cut of your jib, Simpson. Let the fools have their tartar sauce.
Enjoy your tartar sauce, boys. Enjoy. Give me your plate. Don't crowd. Plenty for everybody.
Brilliant. Who could ever have imagined that Simpson's sweeping reforms would pay off so quickly?
You know, sir, accidents decreased by exactly the number that Simpson himself is known or suspected to have caused last month. And our output level was just as high during Simpson's last vacation.
My dear, tired old Smithers, do I detect a note of jealousy?
Okay, so what's the story here, right? What's the story here that Mr. Burns thinks that suddenly there is more tartar sauce for folks, right? And there are fewer accidents. And that's sort of something that they observe, right? They find that, you know, there's more tartar sauce on the one side, fewer accidents on the other side. And the covering law model would be actually absolutely fine with that. I would say, okay, we explained it. Yeah, we are done, we can go home, we found the solution to increase workers' productivity. But as you can already tell here, there's something else happening here. In this case, this is actually a spurious relationship. That's what we call a spurious relationship, that there's something else driving both of these things, right? So there's Homer, who's now not in charge of security, which is probably a good thing, and he's in the kitchen, he hands out more tartar sauce, but at the same time, because he's not in charge of security anymore, there are fewer accidents. So this is now what we call a third factor, or a common response, or I don't know, a confounder, and which actually is responsible for this spurious relationship that we have here. But you see, without being clear about how we get from the one to the other, right, and being very precise about that, we see some correlations in the world, we see some coincidence in the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we came up with a good explanation here, right? So in contrast, that's one of the things I've been pushing here. In analytical sociology, we try to be very clear about how we get from the one to the other, right? So it's really about how are the outcomes being generated, right? So what are the steps that we go to get to reach our explanandum? And there's often, there's a causal chain, there's sort of different things in between, and that's sort of what our mechanism is. So the mechanism, we do not necessarily observe that, right? So it's really hard to pin that down. But the mechanism is actually basically the way how we reach the explanandum from the explanans. And for the mechanism, here's sort of the definition that I already had up in one of the earlier lections. Mechanism is not just the one leads to the other, right? A mechanism is also sort of the entities, the individuals that are involved, their activities, and how they relate with each other, right? And hopefully after today's lecture, this is going to be clear what that means, and why we cannot just look at isolated individuals. Okay, so the mechanisms, these activities, they bring about change, and the type of change brought about depends upon the properties and activities of the entities and the relations between them, and so on and so forth. So it's about how something is being brought about. It's about individuals, their activities, they do something, but they don't do things alone, right? So they're that's in concert. They are in concert, and when they are in concert, or I don't know, one person does something which might have effects on the other person, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of why we also want to look at how the individuals are related with each other. So eventually it's about how our phenomena is brought about, right? So it's about how it's being generated. And when you remember, I don't know if you read this paper or this introductory chapter by Gianluca Manzo, he writes a lot about this generative process, right? So that's sort of also something that is not, some people don't believe that, why I very strongly believe in that, that we need to think about the generative process. So their explanation is a generating exercise, right? It's kind of really looking at how things are being brought about. And Gianluca in his chapter, he then pushes, I come back to that later on, he then pushes, for example, agent-based models, because they allow us to model and to simulate the interactions between the individuals. But I come back to that later on. Okay, so that's our mechanisms, right? Mechanisms are sort of plausible stories, how we get from the one to the other, and mechanisms entail not just the activities of individuals, but also their relationships and their behavior in concert with each other. So a mechanism is sort of something that regularly brings about a certain type of outcome, behavior, or pattern. Okay, so that's mechanisms. Now let's move on to this micro-macro stuff. So that's sort of things that I've been talking about over and over before already. Here, just to reflect back on this, we can look at the macro scale, we can look at the micro scale. Macro scale is something big, micro scale is something small. And when you look at how the social sciences or the sciences work, we are at different levels here, right? You can look at global phenomena up there, you can look at global trade or geopolitics or whatnot. Then you can look at it on the national level. You can do a sociology of Ireland, whatnot. You can go further down, you can look at work groups, You can look at families, something like that. And then, then we go further down, and let's move further down for a bit. But now we are leaving the realm of sociology a little bit. And then you can look at how individuals behave, right? Then you can look at further down, okay, how their brains work, right? Then psychologists sometimes, for them this is big, then they go further down. And then they look at the biochemical level, and then they even go down to the molecular level or to the atomic level or whatnot. So that's sort of how these things are stacked on the top of each other, right? And we are somewhere at the upper part. That's sort of where you find sociology. But even within sociology, you find big differences. So you find some people really engaged with the large stuff. They care about big societies or cultures, while others, care very much about the little things, about roles, families, or interactions and things like that, right? So that's sort of very different aspects. So some people, they look at the big thing. That's sort of what we call macro sociology, and you still find, sometimes departments split into this way, and then you have some other folks that look at the smaller stuff. That's sort of what we call micro sociology. And for a long time, as I said, still some departments are set up like that. These things were sort of opposed to each other. So there were sort of macro and micro sociology being two different levels of analysis to study societies. And not only do you have individual people making up the population you're studying, but you also have different groups, communities, cultures, and the population as a whole. So you have all these different layers that play a role here. And when we talk about macro sociology, macro sociology is sort of this large-scale perspective. You're looking at the big phenomena. For example, social structures, institutions, civilizations, populations, pattern in these populations, and so on. Right? So there, people want to find general trends for these collectivities. How does the unemployment rate look like? How does it change? What is the fertility rate in a society? Things like that. And there are also theoretical strands that are based and located at that level. One example here is functionalism. I don't know if you guys came across that, but that's sort of this idea, coming from Emil Durkheim as well, and that society as a whole, that we should study society as a whole, and we should look at how the institutions adapt to keep the society functioning. That's sort of this idea of functionalism. Or another theory that you can find up there at the macro level is conflict theory. With conflict theories, there are people suggesting that societies are made up of institutions that benefit the powerful and create inequalities. And large groups of people are in conflict with each other until the conflict is resolved. And a new social order is created with equally distributed power. So that's sort of conflict theory in a nutshell. You don't need to know this. I just use this as an example to tell you about what are those guys doing up there at the macro level, right? In contrast, you have then micro-sociology. And that sort of often looks at the small things. It looks at families, groups, face-to-face interactions. And theories that you have there, for example, symbolic interactionism. So it's a micro perspective, focuses on individuals and significance that individuals give, the significance that the individuals give to the meanings in their interactions of the events in their everyday life. And when you look at the history of sociology, these things are pretty apart. I don't know, when you go back to the 60s and 70s, there were these two big figures, right? So actually both in the same department, they had the biggest fights, but they were sort of the two prominent figures in sociology at the time. Was on the one side Talcott Parsons. He was clearly interested in the macro stuff. On the other side, you had George Homans, who was very much more on the micro level, looking at small groups, the human groups, and things like that. So people were sort of at odds for a long time with that, and they didn't really know how to juggle that. And this sort of goes back even to the origins of sociology. And when we look at where it started, some guys. Finally, when you look at those old guys, you always see them old dudes with beards, right? Old dudes with beards. This is Emil Durkheim. That's one of our founding father of sociology. And he suggested, he's often associated with the origins of functionalism, So he suggested that the whole does not equal the sum of its parts. It is something different, whose properties differ from those displayed by the parts from which it is formed. Remember last time, this is exactly the point that I was making, right? So that the whole is different, it's something else from the sum of the parts. However, at the time with Durkheim, they didn't have this idea to resolve that, to understand how the whole can be different than the sum of the parts, in a way. So so when we look back at what happened after Durkheim, people interpreted this in the way of methodological holism. What that means is that we need to look at the whole thing, right? And the whole thing has properties. Society has properties. It's even like as if there's being, right? And that we cannot deduce that. We cannot understand how society can be just an arrangement of individuals in there. So it's all the properties of a given system cannot be determined or explained by its component parts alone. Instead, the system as a whole determines in an important way how the parts behave. Well, you would think this resonates quite a bit with the stuff that we did before, right? But actually, this holism idea is really that the whole is something different. What we're going to do here, and that's sort of how this conflict is being resolved, just to preface it a little bit. To preface it is that the whole is something different, but it is because of the way how the individuals interact with each other. So it's through this idea of emergence that we'll come back later on, through this idea of emergence that sort of the whole, that we see these properties attached to the whole. Doesn't mean that the whole exists as a higher being, right? So we had on this one side this idea of looking at the whole, right? And then on the other side, often associated with Max Weber, one of the other founding fathers in our discipline, he very much stressed this idea that we need to explain social phenomena through individual actions, right? Which in turn must be explained through reference to the intentional states that motivate the individual actors. I would say again, because this sort of resonates with the stuff that I talked about before. But remember, back in the time, these were really conflicting ideas, right? And people had very strong opinions about the one or the other. They didn't really know how to resolve this conflict between the macro and the micro, or structure and agency, I don't know, other dichotomies like that. So from this individual perspective, it's very much this idea of the invisible hand. This goes back to the utilitarians, Adam Smith and so on, right? Guys that things happen invisibly, sort of when individuals just behave and act what is best for them. And then the whole is just the consequence of the individual behaviors. As I said, for a long time, and some people still see it like that, but the point of this whole lecture is that these are not opposing views anymore, right? So these are not opposing things. But for a long time, people kind of thought these things clashed with each other and went to battle with each other. Well, the solution, as I already prefaced, to reconcile these different perspectives lies in what we now call emergence, right? Emergence being there are complex patterns coming about through simple interactions of individuals, right? So it's through the interdependencies of these behaviors, right? Stuff already outlined before. At some point, you have individual elements, little bees flying around, people walking around the street, not really thinking about the whole thing, right? But there are sometimes fascinating patterns evolving here, right? So a colleague of mine, he studied pedestrian flows, how people walk. They did cool stuff. Actually, they redesigned the Hajj in Mecca, how people are being walked through, the pedestrian traffic flow. And often there are these very complex patterns about how individuals behave in there, right? As particles moving around. But it's not because people have a bigger idea in mind when they walk around. No, it's just they follow simple rules, they follow the people around them in a certain way, and together their actions and interactions in concert with the others brings about these properties of the at the macro level that we couldn't explain before, right? Unless, like in the Durkheimian view, we thought that there's something different. There's sort of this higher being which has these properties. So it's about this idea of emergence, and then there are some other guys, there's sort of Robert Merton. He's sort of one of the key figures in analytical sociology, actually, and he suggested, okay, hang on, guys, we need to look at these both. We need to look at both of these things, right? We cannot distinguish them anymore, right? And that's actually, how I think how we should do sociology. There's this dichotomy between macro and micro. It doesn't make sense in my view. It doesn't make sense because you see that society consists of individuals, right? And so individuals are the ones that behave in a certain way, but they don't act in isolation from each other, and only through their actions, interactions, they bring about the broader macro-level phenomena that we observe. So Emergence says, sociology must deal with micro and macro-level phenomena and develop concepts, methods, and data for linking micro and macro analysis. So it's about linking these different things, right? And I think actually this is where sociology can really make a contribution. Now, I think this is sort of where our value added is, right? So I told you, for a while, actually, I was doing this very traditional research about social stratification, right? Social class difference and so on, and it's very noble, and it's important to do, but it was incredibly frustrating because it felt like I'm missing out on the individuals here, right? I'm looking at broader macro level patterns as if there are no individuals acting in these societies, right? And as if individuals are not dependent on each other in some way or the other. But that's I think something that we all can agree that individuals depend on each other. That's one of the fundamental things in our society around us. So it's about linking the micro and the macro, and then even further, Geoffrey Alexander and Giesen says that this dichotomy, that the micro-macro dichotomy should be viewed as an analytical distinction, and that all attempts to link it to concrete dichotomies, such as individual versus society or action versus order, are fundamentally displaced. So he says that we shouldn't try to look at just at the one or the other, but we should actually use them together in as an analytical tool to explain the world around us. Only if it is viewed analytically, moreover, can the linkage between micro and macro be achieved. Okay, so it's about bringing these two things together, micro and macro. And then there's sort of before, in the extreme version of this individual perspective, we call that methodological individualism. That everything is about individuals, they do everything and they go ahead, right? And that's sort of what the world consists of. It's just individual actors. And as you can imagine, this perspective was heavily criticized. It became popular in the 70s at some point, and then it was pretty much bashed down. Now it's pretty much dead, because we know it's not how the world works, right? We know that individuals don't act in isolation from each other. It's not just about the individuals, right? And that's sort of where now this, what Peter Hestrom and Lars Udén call structural individualism comes into place. So it's still about individuals, but individuals, they live within their social context. They live within a structure in a way, and within that structure, they behave and they act. So here they say, we have social structures that constrain individuals' actions and cultural environments, shaping their desires and beliefs. And we have individuals choosing their preferred course of action among the feasible alternatives and various intended and unintended outcomes of these actions. So individuals, and I think we can all agree on that, individuals live their lives within a social context. And when you start looking at that, actually it becomes really crazy to notice how much this social context influences you. It starts with very simple things about which family you're being brought up, which education your parents have. So all these, it doesn't mean that people couldn't go along these lines, right? But because you're sort of set on a certain track, you just go along that, and often you don't even notice these things, right? You don't notice these things because you're so much into it, you're so much surrounded by your environment. Okay, so structural individualism. How do we represent this idea? Well, with a boat. More precisely, it's actually called James Coleman's boat. So that's sort of how it's known in the literature. So James Coleman, another founding father of analytical sociology, if you could call him like that. He wrote this book in the 1990s, Foundations of Social Theory. And in this book, he outlines his mode of explaining things. He says we have a macro level, whatever that is. It can be something different for different people. Right? The macro level, sociology calls it the system of action. And then we have micro level, actors and their resources. And then he says, okay, in order to get from the one side to the other, we need to go down there through the individuals. Well, it's called Coleman's boat because it looks a bit like a boat here, right? But that's actually just how it is. We have macro phenomena that we see. Remember this thing about Protestantism and capitalism, and then we have a dashed line here. I'll come back to the dashed line in a minute. Why there actually is a dashed line, and but then the suggestion is, in order to explain why capitalism comes about in some countries, not in others, we need to think about what does Protestantism do to people. Well, it kind of changes the values that people have, which then leads to individual behaviors, economic action, right? Economic behavior, which then is when everybody behaves like that, we move up again to the macro level. Right? So that's sort of this boat thingy, how it comes about. I have my own version of Coleman's boat, and that's sort of my version of Coleman's boat. And I think this is where my research lies. Yeah? This is where my day-to-day research, if I'm not preparing for lectures here, this is what I do. I look at social networks. And I look at social networks because I think social networks are crucially important to understand both how individuals, when we go from the macro to the micro level, how individuals are embedded in their social context, right? So how what people are, their individual, what generates their values, it sort of depends on the people that they see around them. Right? Or how they are embedded in this society, which is the structure, which is sort of the networks, how they are connected with each other, how they are friends with each other, who they know, who they ask for advice, these kind of things. But then also on the other side, when we go up again from the micro to the macro, as you will see later on, I have examples where people interact with each other, and then it's incredibly important with whom they interact, right? So it's not just that we add things up, right? That we have individuals adding up to the whole again with their behaviors, but it's not just an aggregation, but it's more than that. It's sort of a transformation where individuals influence each other, and there the structure of who they influence and how they influence each other is obviously important as well. So that's sort of why, in my view, in order for this whole boat to sail, how cool is this graph? Yeah? How cool is this graph? In order for this boat to sail, I think there need to be social networks at the very core of it, which is a fascinating field of study anyway, but I think there's also an epistemological reason, and I hope that I outlined this here. Okay, let's go back to James Coleman. So he's this guy, he sort of said, okay, now let's look back at some of those classics, that I talked about earlier. Let's look back at what Max Weber did. Yeah? And then he says, now let's look at what Max Weber did wrong. Yeah? So remember, Max Weber establishes this relationship between Protestantism and capitalism. So he goes out and he finds that capitalism emerged in countries that were predominantly Protestant. Yeah? That's sort of an observation that Max Weber makes. And then Coleman says, well, the way Weber explains this is a little dodgy. It's actually not that clear. So he suggests, this is actually Coleman's way. So when we link these things, it's not something that Weber said, but that's something how Coleman kind of then made sense of what Weber wrote. And now we are, this is sort of the graph from Coleman's book here. Now we have Protestantism linked with capitalism on the other side. It's kind of this thing, I talked about it before. Protestantism then changes the values that people have, right? They think they shouldn't waste their time because wasting time would be wasting time they could use to praise God. So there's a focus in the Protestant ethic on living an ascetic life, living a useful life, not dilly-dallying around like the Catholics in Ireland, right? So that's sort of the opposite. That's sort of the Protestant values here, which then individuals behave according to these values leads to economic behavior, right? Because that's sort of an expression of how useful they use their time, or how much they don't waste their time. And then if everybody behaves like that, we live in a capitalist society. That's sort of this idea how Coleman links these things with each other. Okay, so we have these arrows 1, 2, and 3. But still at the top there's sort of this connection here, right? But the connection is made then through the lower level. When we look at now, this is sort of another, I promise you lots of these boats. So here they are. This is now a graph from a paper that Peter Esram wrote. It's an annual review article. And now again, we have the macro level here, and we have the micro level. And now he spells these things out. So we have a macro level association with the dash points in between, right? So that's sort of the thing that we might observe. And then we need to dig in, and we need to look at situational mechanisms, we need to look at action formation mechanisms and transformational mechanisms. Situational mechanisms, this is sort of how individuals, or sometimes it's called the logic of the situation, sort of how individuals perceive their environment, right? How do they kind of apply whatever the macro phenomena is, their context in which they are in, to their individual situation, so that actually it is the thing that then is the foundation for what they do at the individual level. Then we have action formation mechanisms. Now that's sort of how individuals behave. And then we have these transformational mechanisms, which is sort of what happens when everybody goes up again. Okay, so why do we still have this arrow there at the top, right? These dashed things at the top. Well, remember what I said earlier about different disciplines being at different levels here, right? So for psychologists, for us, the individual behavior, that's sort of the micro level, right? That's sort of this link between values and economic behavior. That's sort of at the micro level for us. Individuals do that. For psychologists, this would be the macro level, right? So the psychologists would say individuals, yes, they behave there at some point, but their behavior is driven by what their brain cells come up with, and that's sort of the micro level, right? So then for the psychologist, there would be something below. The psychologist would say, well, we shouldn't really just say that there's a connection between individuals' values and individuals' behaviors, what they do at the end of the day, because it goes through how their brain works, right? And there are sort of all bunch of cells involved and so on. So that's sort of what he would say, what we should look at. We should found it on this micro level below. Then the chemist would come along. Sounds like a joke, the sociologists and psychologists and the chemist come along. And the chemist comes along and says, dear psychologist, that's still far too macro, right? There are these brain cells, yes, they do something, but whatever happens in each brain cell sort of is the result of what happens at the lower level of molecules, right? And they sort of interact with each other and they do something. They come about with why this brain cell suddenly sends out a neuron or something else. Right, so you can see how you can have this almost infinite regress lower down to the lower levels, right? And so it is, and so if we wouldn't have the error at the top, where we say, okay, this is sort of what we observe, and to some degree we just need to accept that, right? And disciplines, our jobs is to make sense of this upper arrow through the levels below, so that other disciplines then can make use of the arrow number 4 that we had there at the top, right? So I build on the research of psychologists, sort of come up and have reasonable ideas about how individual behaviors come about through the micro level on the cellular level, right? And the psychologist builds on the explanations that the chemist comes up and how cellular behavior comes about through the lower level of molecules and so on and so forth, right? So that's sort of why we still have this arrow there at the top. Okay, so now let's look into linking this stuff. And the interesting part is when you bridge these levels, right? So it's also called bridge hypothesis sometimes in the literature, but it's really about these linkages here, right? So we can look at two linkages. First, from the macro to the micro, and then the other one from the micro to the macro. Okay, let's first talk about the macro to the micro. How does that work? Well, it works through constraints and opportunities. So we all know all our lives are constrained in one way or the other, right? They are constrained through our social context, and as I said, often we are not even aware of that, right? And there's fascinating stuff. I don't know if you ever came across a guy called Pierre Bourdieu. Yeah, he wrote about the habitus. The habitus is sort of this thing that determines to some degree how we behave. Yeah, the kind of culture we consume, the kind of things that we like, the way we go through our life, right? And this habitus you could wonder, how does this work? Does this really determine something? Or does this tell me how my life is going to look like just because, I don't know, I come from this family, you know, my family, they grew up in this village, and that sort of makes me the person who I am? Well, that's not really true, but it sort of, it puts me on a certain track, right? If you grew up in another context, I don't know, if your parents lived a very international life or something like that, you are at a very different place to begin with. And it's not just then that you have different constraints and opportunities, but it also changes the way you think about stuff. So the way one clever person once explained this habitus idea to me was that he said, it's the unchosen principle of all our choices. We make choices in our life, and we make these choices with certain heuristics, right? With certain ideas that we have about what makes sense to us. Yeah? Should I go to university? Should I study sociology? Should I attend analytical sociology? What the hell? Yeah? All these kind of things, right? Or should I go and should I become a builder? Should I become a carpenter? You know, these are sort of choices that we make in our life. And you know, this person told me it's the unchosen principle of these choices. So to some degree, there's a principle underlying the choices that we make that we don't choose ourselves. Right? That's something that has been given to us, right? And that's also what you see. Nowadays we have pretty much equality. Of course, there's the financial aspects of it, but pretty much nowadays everybody can go to the university, right? Or in some countries, there's not even the financial aspect to it. Everybody can go to the university. But what we observe is that there's still a big class divide. How can that be? Right? How can that be that there's still sort of a difference that, I don't know, when you are from a working class family, it's much harder for you to go to the university, regardless of you being intelligent or not intelligent. That's sort of the thing. Why? Because you're sort of put on a certain track, you know, sort of your environment just shapes our lives, right? Just shapes sort of how we think, just shapes our heuristics, how we go through our life. And that's sort of where the inequalities come from. Okay, so it's constraints. We are often constrained about things in our life, and sometimes in ways that we are not even aware of. But it's also about opportunities. And in the literature, we call this the opportunity structure as well. Opportunity structure means differential access to opportunities among those variously located in social structure. What does it mean? Well, you know, there's one study that I want to mention here, which is a landmark study in sociology. You know, there are a handful of landmark studies. It's like the Polish peasant, here the American soldier, or then Coleman's education report, or Lassarsfeld's study on Marine thought. So there are sort of a few handful landmark studies that were huge at the time. And this was a study, you know, where social scientists and psychologists, social psychologists, they actually were heavily embedded at the time in the Second World War. So they went along with the American troops, and they interviewed 500,000 of them. So it was a huge enterprise. They did in-depth interviews with them, surveys with them, and so on. Yeah? And learned a great deal about. It was about racial integration, but also about so many other aspects about how the life at the at the army works. And one of those findings that the American soldier now is most famous for is about opportunities. It's about opportunities. And what they found was that soldiers with low opportunities for promotion, right, where they didn't have a chance to get promoted that easily or quickly, they had a more favorable opinion towards these opportunities than soldiers with a higher promotion opportunities, right? So when people are given more opportunities to get promoted, they are unhappier about it. While when people don't have that many opportunities to get promoted, they are happier with these opportunities that they have. It's sort of confusing and contradicting at first, but then when you look at how it actually worked, well, they found that belonging to a group with a high promotion rate creates excessive hopes and increases the risk that those folks might not achieve these opportunities. So if you see everybody around you getting promoted, then you feel really bad about not being promoted. Right? Well, if you don't see anybody around you being promoted, you're fine. So that's also this thing that becomes very interesting when we look at social inequalities or income wealth inequalities. Probably something you can relate with as well. If all your friends get the newest iPhone, you feel bad for having the last generation iPhone. Right? So that's sort of this kind of thing where the opportunities around us actually affects individual sentiment. So now we have sort of this link going up from the macro level. We have the promotion rate. That's sort of the macro property here. And it goes down to the individual sentiment, which is the micro property. Okay, so that's sort of the linkage from the macro to the micro. Now let's look at the other part, right? So going up again, because that's sort of the interesting stuff where sociology comes into play. From the micro to the macro. Okay, so that means individuals behave, and we need to look at how do we arrive at the broader pattern out there, right? And I hope that I hammered this point home last time, that it's not just the sum of the individuals, right? So that's sort of the key thing here. It's not that easy to go up again. So now let's look at this thing. This is New York. This is New York. You all know where we are. So there's sort of Manhattan, the island of Manhattan. There's this Queens, and there's Brooklyn down there. You see it, and the 2000, and now you actually see color-coded the level of racial segregation in these neighborhoods, right? So the more yellow these neighborhoods are, the more white people live there, and the green neighborhoods tell us there are more than 75% black people, and the red neighborhoods tell us there are more than 75% Hispanics. So when you just look at this map, you would think New York is full of racists. This is sort of what you would think, because it's extremely segregated. It's extremely segregated. There are neighborhoods that are almost completely white, and there are other neighborhoods that are almost completely black. That's sort of the thing. Now, if you look at the macro level, you would say, okay, New York is full of racists. But now I'm going to show you an alternative explanation, right? That builds on this aggregation, builds on these transformational processes. So what I have here now, this is sort of, and this is sort of also the kind of stuff that I do. Yeah? Now you'll see the results of a computer simulation. So now you see basically an artificial world, right? That's an artificial world. And now we have individuals populating different spaces in this world. We have red and blue individuals. Right? And then the black dots is sort of our empty spaces. And I just roll them over this world. They populate certain places at random. And then I have a very simple rule. Which says, okay, when you are a red person, you want to have at least 30% other reds around you. So you would be happy living in a world with 70% blues around you, right? So you would be happy actually to live in a highly integrated world. You just want to have some people around you. Not 70%, like at the map before, right? But just some people. 30%, which is a very different number than 70%. And if somebody is then unhappy about that, somebody finds himself in a situation surrounded by more than 70% individuals from the other color, this individual moves. And that's what you're going to see in the movie that I'm going to show you now. Because then they move elsewhere. And what happens then? Well, they change the world for others. Two places. First, where they lived before, because then suddenly there's one person less there, right? So if I was red and then I'm moving, then my neighbors see one red person less in their neighborhood. But it also changes the world where they moved to, right? Because then suddenly I'm happy there, but maybe then somebody else becomes unhappy of that, right? And that's sort of where then these cascades kick off. So let me run this. Oh, it doesn't work. Well, let me run this to you now in another context. So now this is live. I thought I'd show you the video, but now let's run this live. Yeah. So now we have these green and these red individuals here, and now you see in only a few steps, the whole thing separates, right? So now you see, it looks like really, now we arrive at this 70% or even more level of segregation, while in fact individuals, in this case, they only wanted to have 30% individuals being similar to them. That's the kind of stuff, and that's sort of the thing. This is actually now an example of an agent-based model, and that's also the kind of stuff that I do or other people do here at UCD. And when you look closer at how this thing actually looks like, it's not too complicated. It's a very small little. It's a program that basically just defines this rule about what individuals should do, right? How do individuals behave in relation to the people around them? So go back. Okay, so strong segregation can occur even when individuals have a preference to live in an integrated world. The behaviors of some individuals change the world of others, which might then trigger other individuals to behave in certain ways, and so on and so forth. So there you see how now we have individual preferences to not be completely surrounded by others, can actually lead to something like this racial segregation at the macro level. So there we have now this transformation going up. So it is about generating stuff. And the way we do this thing, that's sort of why it's actually a very exciting time to be a sociologist, and also an exciting time to be at UCD these days. Because now we actually have the tools. We have the ways, which is something very recent to get a hold of this linkage from the micro to the macro again, right? And we do this, as I just showed you a little bit, with what we call agent-based modeling. There we in theory, we could also do this mathematically, but this becomes incredibly complicated, defining all the interactions between individuals and what it leads to. But here we can simulate the outcome of individual behaviors, of their actions and their interactions with each other, right? So that's sort of an agent-based model, and that sort of was an example that I showed you before. You just saw it. It's very simple and very easy to learn, and very exciting. But there's a true epistemological reason here why we do that, right? Because it allows us to get a grip onto this linkage from the micro to the macro level. And then we go back to the data that we have. Then I can go, and in the ideal world, and that's sort of what Gianluca outlines, in the ideal world we build our model, our way, how we think, how individuals act and interact with each other. This produces a pattern of data that we can then link back to what we observe in the real world. Okay, so this is sort of how this pattern looks like, one boat. What a lot of people suggest, and to some degree, I do it as well, that we actually should think of it like that. It's sort of a constant sequence of going from the macro to the micro, right? Individuals behave, which changes the macro conditions for others, and then they behave in some ways, or in other ways, right? Okay, well, I also have this thing about where I motivate again why I do social network analysis, right? But I think I brought this point home. So for me, it's really about networks being the interaction structure that kind of play a role both in when we go from the macro to the micro level, but then they also play a role in when we go up from the micro to the macro level again. And these network structures, they constantly change as well. So that's sort of then a macro feature that we need to explain, or when we look at the evolution or the dynamics of networks, which is stuff that I do. Anyway, thanks very much, guys. So for Thursday we start with the wisdom of the crowds. So read the first 20 pages of the book. Thanks.